Hello, everybody, and welcome to an evening edition of the Atheist Reformation. Joining me tonight is a special guest, Dr. Robert Price. How are you doing tonight, sir?
Oh, real well. I hope you are yourself.
I'm doing fantastic, even more fantastic now that we've been able to make this happen. This has been in the works for a couple of months now, trying to get everything situated from schedules to software to all sorts of fun things.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to take the blame for that because if I weren't so computer ignorant, you already had the tools to do it, but I couldn't access them somehow. It's a real mess.
Skype is finicky for all sorts of people. I know I had hell and a half with it a few different times, so don't feel bad. I would not chalk that up to computer illiteracy. I would chalk that up to potential issues with Skype because they are prevalent since Microsoft took them over. So to give a proper introduction to my guest here, my guest today is Dr. Robert M. Price. He has been a self-described Christian atheist, currently best known as American New Testament scholar who has argued against the existence of a historical Jesus. Dr. Price has taught theology and religious studies at the Johnny Coleman Theological Seminary, possessing dual PhDs in both systematic theology and New Testament scholarship. He is a professor of biblical criticism at the Center for Inquiry Institute and the author of several books on biblical studies and the historicity of Jesus, perhaps most notably Deconstructing Jesus and the Case Against the Case for Christ, which is a refutation of a book by a similar title, The Case for Christ, published and written by Reverend Lee Strobel. A former Baptist minister, Dr. Price has also worked with the Jesus Project and sits on the advisory board of the Secular Student Alliance, as well as being a published horror author with introductions in such works as the Nyarlathotep Cycle, stories about the God of a Thousand Forms, and is an avid H.P. Lovecraft fan, which you and I actually share a common thread on.
Yeah.
And you also have a book which was released earlier this year entitled Christ Superstition. So please, everybody, go look that book up, buy it, give it a read, and let everybody know what you think, because I think everybody will enjoy it. That a decent enough introduction, I think, maybe?
Yeah, though I must say, I got to correct the Wikipedia article in that I no longer have any connection with Johnny Coleman Theological Seminary. They kind of kicked me out because of my political conservatism,
Really?
which you would think would not be the issue if you're just discussing the Bible and theology. And I separated myself from the Center for Inquiry and the Jesus Seminar for the same reason, only I initiated that because they suddenly announced after the election of Donald Trump that their big agenda item would be to oppose anything Trump did. And I said, hey, you're not speaking for me, sayonara. So I'm more of a lone wolf than ever now, but that's fine.
Well, consider myself corrected, and I retract all that information since you do not wish to be affiliated with them. And I completely understand it on that point. I mean, on the political side, I lean more conservative than most, even though I have some social liberalism floating in there, although I would more call it social libertarianism.
Right, I know what you mean.
I've been doing some deep diving on philosophy a lot recently, and particularly interested in the works of Jean-Paul Sartre and his atheist existentialism. That's been kind of fascinating, in all honesty. And I find myself in large agreement with a lot of what he says, with it basically boiling down to, congratulations, you exist. Any purpose you derive from life is something that you derived. You make your own purpose. And I thought that was kind of, to me, the ultimate meritocracy in both the physical and I guess even the metaphysical stance.
Yeah, I think that Nietzsche said the same sort of thing. And it seems to me that it's, well, two things. The meaning of life is not better than life. I mean, that's one thing. You don't have to wait till you can figure out some less than obvious script or agenda for life that's much less one someone else has defined and is trying to sell you on. And the second one, meaning is in the eye of the beholder, because where the heck else could it be? I mean, even if God said, hey, this is the meaning of your life, yeah, who says? I mean, even if it's God, as a great old Jewish story says, the rabbis are debating on a point of Torah, and they're sick of Rabbi Eliezer's heretical views, and one of the, I guess the head rabbi says, let God himself settle the issue. So the voice of God is heard, and it says, my son Rabbi Eliezer is right, heed him. And the opposing rabbi said, oh no, you don't. That's not for you to decide. When you gave the Torah to humanity, you gave us the right and responsibility to interpret it. Well, yeah, God's opinion would be just one more opinion. His morality or anything else would be no different than anybody else's guess. So, this whole thing, don't torture yourself. Well, what's the meaning of life? Just go out and live it. There's no more meaning than that.
Right. I think if people want to know what the quote unquote meaning of life is, then they should just probably listen to the Monty Python song of the same name, and they'll get about as much out of that as anything else.
Oh, what a great movie.
It really was. Oh, man. Although personally, the accountancy shanty was one of my personal favorites. That was always one of my really found hilarious.
Yeah.
So talking about a couple of things that kind of reach more towards your work and history as a debater and things like that. Are you familiar with Dr. Edward Fazer?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay. Well, suppose what it looks like he's been doing a lot is trying to redefine, to some extent, and reintegrate Aquinas's 5 ways as far as philosophical arguments, such as the actualization of potential when talking about the argument from motion and I don't know. When I read it, it seems overly wordy for no apparent reason. But there again, I'm not a degreed philosophical scholar or anything like that. I can only go by what I see. And to me, what others consider a masterpiece, I look at it and see this just seems like an overly wordy, legalistic version of Aristotelian physics, which we know don't work.
Yeah, it seems very strange. Well, for one thing, it almost doesn't matter because, as Aquinas himself freely admitted, even if you agree with him that God, quote unquote, exists, this is not the God of the Bible. He made no pretense for having proven the existence of Jehovah. He said this can be known by reason. I'm not so sure of that, but he thought that. But he said reason cannot tell you heavenly secrets like that God is a Trinity, that he has a son, that he's acted to save humanity, etc. No, of course not. That you have to accept by faith precisely because it is a revelation. It's right. What you couldn't have known any other way. And so faith means, though you cannot prove it or discover it, if you're going to accept it, this is the way it has to be accepted. You're taking a risk, but he knew you weren't proving the biblical or the Catholic God.
Right. At best, it was arriving at essentially what he considered to be a rational notion of God, not necessarily the Christian triune God or anything like that.
Yeah.
So looking back on some of the stuff that you did with William Lane Craig back several years ago, knowing his propensity for really just attempting to rehash the Kalam argument time and time again, when you had your encounters with him, did you ever expect him to do anything different, or is that just kind of the hill he chooses to die on continuously?
Well, that I'm not so familiar with. I just dealt with him as a New Testament scholar and his apologetics of that kind. I've never been that interested in the various cosmological arguments. They just seem to me they cannot escape paper. It's hard for me to take them seriously as reality. In fact, like with Anselm's ontological argument, it just seems to me like a kind of a weird logical trap. I cannot see going from that to becoming convinced that that God exists, any kind of a God. It just seems like a kind of a trick some way.
It kind of does seem like that, because when you look at even Plantinga's what is it, maximally great being thing that he talks about throughout his version of ontological argument, it seems as though it's just one big begging the question session, because at some point the conclusion is assumed in at least one of the premises. And so I guess from just a sheer syllogistic standpoint, it doesn't seem to hold water. But there again, it to me focuses on the power of imagination. Can you actually imagine something greater? Okay, sure, probably. I mean, it could fly or something like that. And then they try to assume it's like, well, this is something that no matter what you could ever imagine, it's always greater than that. I was like, but if it's greater than anything I can imagine, how do I know there's nothing greater than that?
Yeah.
Because at that point, it seems to be a limitation of my intellect, of my creativity, not the greatness of the thing. But that's just me.
Well, also the idea that if that than which no greater can be conceived exists, its existence must be a necessary existence, not a contingent one. Okay, maybe so, but does that prove that which cannot be than which nothing greater can be conceived? Does that prove it does exist? It seems to me all to be captive to a hypothetical. It's like saying, if there's a God, what kind of God would it be? And I just find that utterly uncompelling. It just seems to me just hanging. It's just on the blackboard and nowhere else.
Right. I agree with you wholeheartedly on that one. And it comes to the same thing when they talk about these arguments from efficient causes, essentially boiling back down to Aristotelian physics on relying on celestial bodies being fixed and in perfect orbit, or stars simply not moving ever. It breaks down as soon as you apply what we know about physics today. Like they talk about efficient causation and then vertical causation as if that somehow escapes the temporality of the issue. If an effect can't come before a cause, or for an effect to exist, there must be a preceding cause. The fact that something precedes it automatically assumes time. And to the best of our knowledge scientifically, time doesn't exist until the Big Bang. So there is no before the Big Bang.
Yeah. I like Martin Luther's reply to that, which has the merit, I guess, of being humorous, at least. He said that when somebody asks, what was God doing before he created time? Luther said, well, he was growing a field full of cane so it could break one off and beat people that ask questions like that. Oh, what the heck?
Yeah. I mean, because it's the most readily available counter to it. It's like, if there's no before the first, if first means there's nothing before it, then what was being done? There couldn't have been anything done.
Yeah. And that just destroys this idea that Augustine and no doubt others posited that God experiences an eternal present, an eternal now. Well, if that's true, you've just walked through the dimensional gateway to non-dualist Vedanta Hinduism. You're
Yeah.
saying that all the so-called actions of God, including creation, are only seeming that way, and they're part of a world of relative illusion or samsara. God doesn't really act, because that would imply temporality in God, and also that he was not a perfect being, since moving from a potential creator to an actual creator means God has changed. And it just falls apart. And Hinduism dealt with this by saying, well, yes, on the ultimate level, there's only Brahman,
Mhm.
being consciousness, bliss, Satchitananda. And though there is a kind of a personified demiurge, the god Brahma without the N on the end, he's really, or Ishvara, the Lord, he's as real as we are as his worshippers. But if you were really to be enlightened, you'd see that all of that was just a dream, and there's only ever been the one, and you've always been it. And I don't see how you can take Augustine's view and come up with anything different.
In all honesty, I have to find myself in complete agreement with you. Uh, the Augustinian approach seems to hold no more water than the Thomistic approach, and if it did somehow hold more water, I mean, we're talking about a thimble at best. It seems when it comes to the whole, I guess, overall rationality of it, or trying to somehow believe you're harboring some exclusivity to the private club for the one big all over super god.
And if you say you've got to believe this, even though it's incomprehensible, I don't think you can believe such a thing, because there's nothing there to believe. It's like, oh, the Trinity. Yes, I believe in the Trinity. In the what?
Mhm.
What are you talking about? And to hear anybody try to explain it, it never works. And then a theologian can say, oh, well, that's no surprise, given that you're dealing with an infinite being. No wonder our puny little minds can't encompass that. Yeah, I could see that, but then stop pretending there is some content that the mind can grasp, which it
Mhm.
must if it is to believe something. There's nothing to believe, even if somehow there's some higher truth that corresponds to this in some way.
Mhm. It's like when I look at um, what's commonly kind of referred to as the Punnett square, belief versus knowledge. You have Gnostic and agnostic atheism, and then Gnostic and agnostic theism. Well, if you're asserting that God is this incomprehensible, impossible to understand being, you could never hope to understand what he does or how he does or why he does, then why are there Gnostic theists?
You mean, what do they not think it's incomprehensible?
Right. I mean, they would have to think it's not incomprehensible, at least on some level, to
Mhm.
be able to assert knowledge of to assert that they can claim knowledge of existence at that point.
Yeah, Francis Schaeffer always used to try to get around that by saying that what we know of God, we do know. It's sufficient, but not exhaustive. That's kind of slippery, because that's sort of what Anselm said about whether God can be said to love anybody.
Right.
And
It's
he said,
ontological.
well, no, not really, but whatever it is, it's analogous to that.
Right.
I'm sorry, that's not close enough for me.
Right. It's tautological. What we know about God, we know. Okay, that's a fancy way of saying it is what it is.
Hmm.
It's just a tautology. It doesn't really have. There's no substance to it at that point.
Yeah.
It's just a bald assertion. So going back to some of your books that you've written, one of the ones that I've gone back and reread it at least a couple of different times, the case against the case for Christ. One thing that I had never come across, but one thing I always had a question about was, did you ever actually have any interactions with Reverend Strobel after that book was published? Did y'all ever speak publicly or privately or anything like that, or did he just kind of ignore the fact that you even did anything?
The latter. In fact, this is so funny. He and I and many other people were invited to speak at some Christian university in a big conference about the doctrine of the atonement, all different possible approaches to it.
Mhm.
And I wrote this paper called The Mythic Power of the Atonement, saying that the idea wasn't just bogus and nothing, even if Christ didn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. But he didn't know that. But Strobel was supposed to appear and speak. And the organizer of the event emailed me and said that he had bad news. The conference was off because Strobel heard that I would be attending and speaking, and he thought it was some kind of an ambush, and so he refused to attend. And since he was the big draw, the whole thing just collapsed. So
Wow.
I kind of think he what he knew he didn't like.
Man, that's crazy. That's often what I seem to see is that if there's an instance where you're debating somebody, whether it be you or even myself in like the one debate I've had publicly on YouTube with a friend of mine named Anthony, is that at some point it just retreats to what their base level assertions are. Like with presuppositionalists, it just goes back to how do you know that? How do you know that? And one thing that really kind of irks me on that one is when they start asking for what is your percentage of certainty? And then they ask after you say, like, if I was to say, okay, I'm 95% sure that a God does not exist. And they ask, well, how sure are you about that? They imagine that there's some kind of infinite regress that goes back. But if you understand math and you understand anything about statistics, you realize that doesn't work, that 95% represents the sum total of all certainty that I could possibly have for that thing. And so to try and walk it back further than that is ridiculous, I think.
And are they suggesting that they, thank God, and Cornelius Van Til have absolute certainty, and that to have certainty, you got to get it from the Holy Spirit or something? Because I don't know, see how they're in a better position.
Yeah, right. Okay, so it's their epistemology, or the way they look at knowledge. They imagine or they assert that there is a third way to know things. Like you have a priori knowledge, which allows certainty but no substance, and then you have a posteriori, which is you can't have total certainty, but you have more substance to it. And then they argue for revelatory knowledge gained through revelation from God, that somehow marries the two together and allows you absolute certainty with infinite substance of the argument, or infinite substance to the information, which to me seems a bit like trying to eat their cake and have it too.
Yeah, the secret of doing that is just to have an unending amount of cake, which I favor. But it's just arbitrary. It's like when people say that if we don't have theism, we don't have any moral standard. Well, I don't think that's true. But if it were, does our supposed need for this objective truth prove that there is such a thing? I mean, Kant was straight on this. He said, I can only use practical reason, not pure reason, in trying to determine whether there's a God. Pure reason won't work because of the antinomies and all that. No, you can't know anything with no sense perception involved.
Right.
So he said, what do we do? How do we make a decision about belief or not? And that's where practical reason comes in. He said, look, are we prepared to accept the implications if we say there is no divine lawgiver and therefore no moral law? Well, I, for one, am not, he said. I have no reason to believe that these things are illusory and the consequences are terrible. So, I believe in God, but he was very clear that you couldn't be certain. It's just like, as other people would say, it's a working hypothesis and so forth. That's pretty honest, and it just seems to me to rule out this Deus ex machina stuff, like a third way of knowing, or how could the world have gotten here? We can't figure out how, so it must have been God, as if we can figure that out. Like, oh, I got an answer to the meaning of X. It's Y. Well, what is Y? Well, we don't know about that. It's impossible to understand. Well, that's no explanation. You're just grabbing at straws there.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. And when I look at presuppositional argumentation, especially the transcendental argument, Matt Slick's new favorite thing derived from Bonson and Van Til before him, is that it seems to be this one great big circular argument from ignorance. It's like, how can we have this without that? And then it assumes that existed all along throughout the entire argument. So it's just this cornucopia of bad going on there, it seems. And I don't remember if Bonson or Van Til made this mistake, but when you go through Slick's version of tag, because this was one of the first arguments posed to me after I kind of became an atheist as far as belief in God was, I sat there and went through it with a fine-tooth comb and found that I think on like point 6 or premise 6 of the argument, it starts conflating logic itself with the laws of logic, or as Slick likes to call it, the logical absolutes. And from that point on, it just broke down even worse. Because it's trying to conflate one thing as being something it already is. It was weird. So, and this is something that I find a lot more common than I would like. And I wanted to see if you agreed with me on this. The apparent tendency that apologetic approaches to existence and even biblical history, which is something I've gotten a lot more into thanks to the likes of you and Dr. Richard Carrier. It seems that they tend to do so from a point of just soliciting an opinion that they already hold as true, versus, say, someone on, for lack of any better analogy, someone on our side of the fence or our side of the aisle, which is just trying to figure out what is the truth of the matter, because the outcome doesn't matter. We just want to know the right thing. Or to use Matt Dillahunty's adage that he takes from David Hume, I want to believe as many true things and not believe as many false things.
Go
ahead, please.
Apologists, as the name implies, are starting with a commitment and then trying to make the best case for it, and usually not on the grounds which led them to believe it. They're spin doctors, basically, and they'll say whatever. Well, let me put it this way. I was about to say they'll say whatever sounds good, and I think a lot of that is going on, offering arguments that they wouldn't really know if they were convincing or not, because that's not what convinced them. Rather, their convincement comes from the fact that any argument or evidence seems most plausibly, seems plausible the more it comports with what they already believe, which is like the sounding board for it. Sure, it sounds plausible to say that if you're dead set on believing that there are no contradictions in the Bible, when somebody says, how do you explain the different settings of the denials of Peter? It seems like you can't squeeze them into 3 because of the different people or groups that Peter was talking to, depending on which gospel you read. Well, if somebody says, okay, there weren't 3, there were 6, or some have said 8 to get them all in. And It doesn't say. Jesus doesn't say, before the cock crows, you will have denied me at least 3 times. Just 3 times. And but that sounds good to somebody like Harold Lindsell, who did. He's one of the most recent ones to field that argument. And why does it sound good? Would it if it were any other context? No. But since it comports with biblical inerrancy, he honestly feels, well, that's the best way to read it. But if you don't, and I guess this is like John Loftus's outsider test for religion, would you really accept this or that reading of the text if you weren't trying to get out of a tight spot? That's what I always say. And I think people sort of know that's what they're doing. They just think it's legitimate until they're called on it.
Right. That's something that I kind of see a lot happening too, especially when I watch different debates. Like one of the most recent debates that I watched was Matt Dillahunty debated a guy. His last name was Winger. I think it was Matt or Mark Winger. I can't remember for sure. But after once it got into cross-examination between the two, Winger just started throwing stuff out like he thought that Matt Dillahunty was attacking him or something, or kept trying to assert that he was being attacked because Dillahunty would use his typical rhetorical devices of talking about universe creating pixies as a way to demonstrate the absurdity of the argument that was being presented. And so he took it as a personal attack and just kept accusing him of ad hominem. And it was bad. And that's what a lot of it seems to boil down to nowadays. It's like you were saying, it works so great up until the point where they actually have to defend it, and then all hell breaks loose, which is apparently what they're working against. But the irony is there, I think.
Well, if you argue that way, it's automatically an ad hominem argument. Oh, you're just being mean to me. Well, right. I remember once I said that to believe Jesus is listening to you and answering your prayers, and this is the common way of things with people who have a personal relationship with Christ. Imagine billions of people communicating with Jesus who you are depicting as still some kind of human presence, even if he's liberated from the body or whatever. And they do. I mean, the whole personal relationship thing implies that. How is this any different than believing that Santa Claus comes down the chimney of every house on earth in one night? Well, the guy I was having the exchange with said, well, that's just frivolous and insulting. I said, well, I don't care if it is. What's wrong with the analogy? Well, right. No answer to that. It's not, I mean, just to take the high ground. It's just a retreat to you're being mean to me.
Exactly. It seems as though, oh gosh, but my brain died there for a moment. It's that they just keep backpedaling and backpedaling on it as soon as they go on the defensive. So, talking about the based on your understanding of philosophy and logic, because when it comes to all this, I am an absolute layman. I've taken a single semester class on logic in my current studies towards political science and whatnot. So, a philosopher, I am not. At best, I'm an amateur. At worst, I'm a petty dabbler. So based on your understanding of philosophy and logic, would you consider the assertion that Jesus Christ was both fully God and fully man as a possible violation of the law of non-contradiction, since they want to trot out the laws of logic as often as they do?
Well, the illogical part to me seems, because they say here again that this is an unfathomable mystery, and when you say that, all right, but I wouldn't try to prove that it's true. No. And I mean, there may be something to this that we just can't understand. There's certain things about, what are quasars? We don't know, and stuff like that. But if if your defense presupposes that it does make sense, when in your better moments you realize that it doesn't, even if true, because it's a divine mystery, the depths of God and so on. Like I have no qualm about people that, out of an intuitive sense or whatever, believe there is a God and that God is way beyond our grasp, who then worship the divine mystery. I don't think any bogus claims are being made there.
No.
They have an opinion that there is some higher level of being. That I'm suspicious of, idealist metaphysics, but that's not the problem. But when you start trying to defend and explicate the Trinity, that's doomed to failure. And you can see with the dual natures of Christ, you can see the problems there that beset it. Through the developments in the Christological controversies, where the pendulum kept swinging from one side to the other. Is the Logos of the same nature with God, or the first creation of a like nature with God? Well, they vote on it, and this is just what Francis Schaeffer used to say in his better moments, that you can't determine the truth by a nose count. How many of you guys believe that the Logos is of the same nature?
Right.
Does that prove anything? Well, it shouldn't. But then they decide that the Logos that was incarnate in Jesus was truly God. Well, then they don't determine what is the status of the human nature of Christ. So Apollinaris, a disciple of Athanasius, says, well, he really was not completely human. He had a human body and a human soul, or mind, I guess you could say. But as for the Logos, that took the place of a human's spirit, because it's got to be in there somewhere. And then the three Cappadocian theologians, Gregory, and Basil, said, no, that's not going to work, because doesn't Christ save us by assuming humanity and therefore sort of permeating it with divinity so that we gain immortality like his? Well, if he doesn't have the whole human makeup, what's he going to do? Save 2/3 of an individual? That can't be. And so he has to be fully God and fully man. Well, then they move on to the question of how are those two natures balanced off or related? And I think it's wait a minute, no, it's Eutychus, the first Monophysite. He says, well, all right, they're distinct until the conception, and at that point the divine nature absorbs or subsumes the human nature, and one nature unique to Christ is the result. But others said, no, that can't be, because that's not really two natures. So then Nestorius comes along and says, well, there's really, in effect, two persons, the divine and the human. And then others said, no, that can't be. What's the difference between that and between Jesus and the prophet Isaiah? Isn't Jesus just kind of a channeler or a prophet then? And then they said, okay, the two natures they cannot be separated, but they don't mingle. Well, all right. In that case, where does the personhood of Christ come from? Mm-hmm. Does that come from the human side or he's one person with two natures, but where does he get the personhood? From the human side of the divine? And he said, must be from the divine. So it's going back in the direction, well, he's really God. He's just sort of superficially human. I don't think they ever came up with a way of dealing with that, but that's what you're asking for if you start putting out formulae like that. And if you're anathematized if you don't believe it, it's just screwed. I mean, there's nothing to believe. I mean, even if it somehow corresponds to the truth, we don't know how.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you on that, because it just boils down to there's no reconciliation between somehow being fully divine and fully human. because you keep having to figure out, well, if he's 100% human, which part of this are we trying to put God in? Which part of this are we putting divinity into? Because as soon as you put divinity into it, I mean, just from a sheer physics standpoint, it's no longer 100% human. Unless you're defying the laws of physics, at which point it's physically impossible. So how could it be extant in reality to begin with? Granted, I'm more of a science-minded guy, so that's kind of where my headspace drifts to when I start looking at things like this.
Well, that's understandable, because when it's the word they use for natures is ousia, and that's essence. And what did they think that was? Or substance, that which stands under. That gets you back to Epicurus and others, that said, well, the gods are made of a very fine matter that is really intangible to us. Well, that's an attempt to deal with it. But if you think that's true, you do come up with this problem that you mentioned.
Right. Because we realize that, okay, when we're talking about very fine matter, well, we've figured out what the building blocks of matter are, as far as we can tell, on the smallest elemental scale, which is the atomic scale. So at that point, okay, where's the divinity at that point? Or how do we find it? And they talk about quarks and things of that nature, but these are, to some degree, almost virtual particles, it seems, when you talk about bosons and all that, that kind of rigmarole. But I won't get too deep into the weeds on that one. I could talk about physics for days and still not make sense to myself in some cases, because quantum physics is hard. I mean, if not even Stephen Hawking can quite figure it out, I don't think Drew from Lufkin, Texas is going to fare any better in most cases.
Yeah, when Einstein couldn't buy it, that kind of excludes me from the whole discussion.
So I want to talk about your book from, gosh, almost 10 years ago now, Jesus at the Vanishing Point. And I'm going to be helpful at this point, because I actually pulled what I thought were like the 3 key points for what you've called the traditional Christ myth theory. So I've got, in the first, there's no mention of a miracle working Jesus in secular sources. And so based on that, you've stated that Eusebius most likely fabricated the Testimonium Flavianum. And then you go to the epistles, which are written earlier than the Gospels, also provide no evidence of a recent historical Jesus to that time. And all that can be taken from the epistles is that Jesus, the Son of God, lived in the heavenly realm, died there as a sacrifice for human sin, was raised by God, and enthroned in heaven. This goes back to the Isaiah prophecy, I think, that Carrier does a pretty extensive breakdown of in that really thick book of his on the historicity of Jesus. And then finally, it brings up the parallel narratives and other Middle Eastern mythos about dying and rising gods, Osiris, Attis, Adonis, and all of them, which also survived into the Greek or Hellenistic and Roman periods, and so arguably would have influenced early Christianity. So with all of those, and in all honesty, with such what seems to be an insurmountable amount of evidence to the contrary, what are some of the common objections that you've encountered when those topics get brought up?
Well, there is with regard to Jesus not being mentioned by contemporary authors or even shortly after authors, that almost boils down to whether you think the Testimonium Flavianum, or as I like to call it, the Testimonium Flimsianum, whether it's genuine or not. And I think it is clear that the whole thing is an interpolation, most likely by Eusebius, who's, well, for a couple of reasons. as everyone points out, it doesn't really fit the context it's in. It seems to interrupt it. Probably it was put there simply because Pilate was mentioned in the adjacent stories and briefly in the Jesus thing. But this actually cuts both ways because, as oh boy, I can't think of his name, one scholar showed the sentence structures in if you compare them from the Testimonium Flavianum with the adjacent Pilate stories, the outrages he perpetrated on the Jews. Pilate is the actor, the protagonist, I guess, on stage, and the others. Here's something Pilate did. Here's something else Pilate did. Here's another thing he did. He did this. Whereas in this one, it's about Jesus, and Pilate is brought in almost as a subordinate consideration. It's like a flashback reference, and so's the crucifixion itself and various other things. Why would the writer, if all of them weren't by the same one, suddenly change the mode of writing, the way he wrote sentences and so on? Plus, it seems to be a defense of Christianity. It's trying to explain why, despite the crucifixion, Christianity still survives to this day, which implies some time has gone past. You still hear apologists say this. Why didn't Theudas the magician or Judas of Galilee found religions that continued? Well, this sounds like someone is making that argument, and it's probably Eusebius. And another scholar points out how the various things that are said in this short text, point for point, address issues in Eusebius's immediate context where he quotes it, that was he really a man, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And this shows from a secular source that yes, Jesus was all of these things. So it's like too good to be true. It's tailor-made for polemics. We know Eusebius did this elsewhere with the epistles of Jesus and Abgarus, the king of Edessa. And he said, I found these letters in the archives of Edessa. It's clear that he didn't. He made it up. And this is another one of those. Even if Josephus did write it, he wasn't a contemporary of Jesus. He's writing about 60 years after the supposed crucifixion. And this fits the Cornelius Tacitus reference, which also is absent from some manuscripts and so on. The thing is that these people lived late enough that there's no real reason to think they had any independent information. They certainly had no memories of the events. Too late. There's just no, I mean, they knew about Christians. There were Christians in their day, and it sounds like they're just repeating the story as Christians were telling it. And so that's out, and there's nothing else that really tells us anything. Now, the rejoinder to that that's often made now is, oh, well, Josephus did mention Jesus, but sneaky Christians interpolated Christian-sounding statements, like it says, he was the Christ. Josephus, whose life depended on saying that the Emperor Vespasian was the biblical Messiah. He's not going to write a book for Jews and Gentiles all over to read and say that Jesus was the Messiah. Origen, who had earlier copies than ours, said, well, one thing we know about Josephus, he didn't think Jesus was the Messiah. Well, how could he have written this? And so people like Bart Ehrman and many others will say, yeah, if you cut out the stuff that would make it seem like a forgery, it doesn't seem like a forgery anymore, but it doesn't seem like much of anything. Like, why is this even there if you tame it down so much? And their whole approach, it's like what I compare to, if someone in the distant future was trying to prove that Superman had actually existed, and they said, well, of course, he didn't fly in the air and he couldn't bounce bullets off his chest and didn't come to Earth in a rocket, but there is reason to believe that there was a reporter called Clark Kent who worked for a prominent metropolitan newspaper.
Yeah.
That's it. Superman was just a reporter for a newspaper. That's it. Like, why would anybody notice of this guy? And I think it's the same thing. You don't have to. The real question is not why would Josephus have taken note of such a figure, but why would Christians have taken note of him? So that argument is just bogus. It's easier to deal with the thing with the dying and rising gods, because the objection to that is that the Christian story of Jesus was earlier than these, and therefore these mystery religion dying and rising saviors were copied from Jesus, not necessarily Baal and all that, the names, but the resurrection stories. This is not true. We know from the pyramid texts, which predate the New Testament by hundreds and hundreds of years, that they believed that Osiris died and rose from the dead, and that people who believed in him would repeat it. We know from artistic representations of Attis, who committed suicide but was raised from the dead, that this predates Christianity. Baal, I mean, you go way back to the Ras Shamra texts of Canaan. Baal dies and rises from the dead, and so on and so on. So that it's just flatly not true that they could have taken it from Christians. And the real nail in that coffin is that Christians, when they addressed this, and they had to, because people were already saying, hey, what about these other saviors? They said well, you see, Satan knew what was going to happen when Jesus came to the earth. And so to throw people off the track, he whispered into the ear of the pagans this. And so they came up with their own copies before the real thing appeared. Yeah, that's the ticket. And no one would argue that way if they thought that the Jesus version was first. They're admitting the other ones are earlier. But this seems to escape apologists.
And see, that also strikes me as kind of odd that they would take that tack to arguing for it, because when I love sci-fi literature and stuff like that, as I'm sure you're a fan of as well. But when you go back and look through it, and also through earlier literary works, prior to the 19th century, we don't see any instances of time travel, because even when you look at the Once and Future King, when you're talking about Merlin aging backwards through time, that's the closest we get to time travel of any real degree. And if I remember right, that was actually written in the 19th century, since it was a derivative work of Le Morte d'Arthur, the French legend from back in the 13th or 14th century. So if you don't have any real evidence of a time traveling literature, why is that argument coming out when talking about this mystical time traveling super demon who's going back in time saying, hey, write this down?
Oh, well, they're saying that Satan was around at the time of the prophets, and this is how he knew that God would send his son who would die and rise, because there were all these Old Testament predictions. Of course, there's no such prediction in the Old Testament, but that's how they viewed it. And of course, I'm not saying that anti-mythicists today are saying this, that's what they simply deny that the Baal, Tammuz, etc. versions were pre-Christian, but I'm saying no. There's plenty of evidence that they were pre-Christian. But even if there weren't, there was this suicidal argument that early church fathers made that show they agreed that the pagan versions were earlier, and they just went to this crazy ad hoc hypothesis to try to explain it. If everybody knew that the Jesus version was first, you'd never argue that way. Just insane. Go ahead.
Oh, it's like when talking about Satan going and doing all these things. Okay, let's assume he was around during the time of the prophets and he did all these things. This still kind of goes back to, I guess, to me the old thought that always popped into my head back when I was a practicing Catholic of, if Satan is a fallen angel and angels had no free will of their own, then how was it that something with no agency was able to resist the thing that created it, despite not having the agency to do so?
Yeah, I don't know how you could possibly square that. Yeah.
And that's also one of the things that started leading me away from Christianity was not being able to reconcile things like that,
Mm.
because there was just, throughout all the Catholic dogma and the quote unquote supporting or additional literature and liturgies attached to all these things, the demonology, the Mary worship, and all these
Mm.
other incidences, nothing ever could, never seemed to be able to even approach answering that question. And even now, I can't answer that question aside from looking at it and saying, quite frankly, it's bullshit.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's all
I hate to use that
opportunistic. It
terminology.
comes in handy at this point, but not that one. And it's sort of analogous to the question of whether you can know God's will, and you pray about it and ask advice and all that. Okay, I know what God wants me to do. I feel the Spirit's leading. Hallelujah. And then what you've decided to do blows up in your face, and you say, I must have been crazy. How could I, a mere mortal, figure out the will of God Almighty? Okay, good inference. But then the next day they're back to doing the same thing, or answered prayer. Oh, yes, you can be assured God will answer your prayer. Then
Yeah.
nothing happens, and you say, well, I guess he did answer, but the answer was no, just like the 8-ball thing. Why don't you adjust your thinking to what happened, but instead it's just switching from one foot back to the other again and again, as either seems handy to rid you of your headache at the moment. They just don't care about the logic of it.
Right. It's like, why go through all the mental gymnastics of eventually arriving at what's ultimately just a post hoc rationalization? And as George Carlin says, why even bother praying? Let's just skip to his will then, if you're going to go that route. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And
That's what Meister Eckhart said back, I think, in the 13th century. So the only prayer you ought to pray is, thy will be done, in order to align yourself with the will of God. I mean, he's the only one who really seemed to see the implications.
yeah, and so looking at we're going to step outside the realm of the assertion that Jesus was a real person, and just look at it from a literature standpoint, a literary standpoint. So something that you said, I think it was in the Christ myth theory. I think that one was 2011. I want to say was that every detail of Jesus's narrated life fits the mythic hero archetype. So when you're talking about that one and how it's present in all cultures at that point, with that paraphrasing of a excerpt of the book, does that kind of align you with some of the same positions that Joseph Campbell had on the subject? Because it seems to pull a lot from his aspects of what a hero is, from a literary standpoint.
Yeah, Campbell was dependent on Carl Jung, and I think these various folklorists who talked about, like Lord Raglan wrote a book called The Hero, where he dealt with this. Yeah, he. Now, I grant that sometimes the biographical facts of some historical figures fit the stereotype, but usually not as many of them, and also quite often they've these more spectacular traits have been added on in the form of legend, like with Caesar Augustus. He was called the savior. There was a miraculous conception story about him. There was a story where the corrupt Roman senators, they couldn't have been much worse than the ones we have. They plotted to kill the infant Augustus because they knew somehow that he would bring an end to the Roman Republic and establish the empire. So they tried to kill him, but it didn't work, and so forth. When there was a marker put up celebrating the birthday of Augustus, and it said, we were proclaiming the beginning of the gospel of a new age of peace, thanks to Augustus. But there's nothing about Augustus being resurrected or assassinated or anything like that. So it's just on one end of his life, you've got that. And this cuts two ways too, because the reason we don't dismiss Augustus as a myth too, as we do with some of the others, like possibly the Buddha, definitely Krishna and others. The big reason is that history makes no sense if there wasn't an Augustus Caesar. There's way too much documentation that showed that he was woven into the tapestry of his time. But with Jesus, we don't have that. It seems like we do when they say, well, Herod the Great existed, and he was a murdering paranoid. Certainly it's not out of character that he would have feared some new kid was being used as a, here's the real king of Israel, and in his name we're going to rise against terror. That could have happened. But the thing is, there's no mention of this in Josephus or any place else where they do detail the crimes of Herod the Great. They could have just missed this one, but if he's like killing all the boys in this one town, and this looks so much like the slaughter of the innocents in Josephus's life of Moses, and it does. What are you going to say? Which is more likely? I mean, since Matthew elsewhere tries to make Jesus look like a new Moses, that's doubtful. What about Herod Antipas? We know there was a Herod Antipas. Whether he had anything to do with Jesus, you can't really tell that. Caiaphas, the head of the Sanhedrin, we know he existed. They found his tomb 10 years or so ago. But look at what he does in the one event with which he's tied in the Gospels. He is there at the helm of a hearing or trial in the Sanhedrin on Passover Eve of all times. No chance.
No,
it's absurd. And then Pilate. Well, come on now. Pilate surely didn't have any scruples about killing messiahs. We know of other ones he killed. Yeah, but look at this story. He how did they get him not to condemn Jesus to begin with? He's trying to get out of doing it. He was afraid of a bunch of rowdies in the street outside. He thought they would get him in trouble with Caesar. It's absurd. He wouldn't have wasted 5 minutes on this, because again, we know a good bit about Pilate and his ruthlessness and his anti-Semitism, and he lets go a guy known to have killed Romans in an insurrection. Jesus, I don't really see anything wrong with him, but I'll let this anti-Roman terrorist go and string this guy up. It's absurd. And if you take those away, that's it. You've got no tie-in to contemporary history with Jesus. So you can't prove any of this, but it looks so fishy in so many ways that I just think you really got a job on your hands to try to make Jesus look like more than a myth.
Right. And in all honesty, I suppose the irony is lost on people who go down that route, because they want to get really angry when, they want to bring up talking about morality and how atheist regimes lead to terrible things, and they bring up the Holocaust, to which we obviously counter with, No, Adolf Hitler was a practicing Christian and quite devout. That's why he went about the things he went about. That was one of his justifications or his rationalizations for that. And then they try to say it's like, well, you're trying to condemn all of Christianity in a way of guilt by association. But when you look at these arguments talking about Herod and Pilate as somehow being in support of the existence of Jesus, is that not an attempted guilt by association to promote his existence?
Well, it didn't take too long before some of the churches, notably the Coptic Church, canonized Pilate as a saint. He's Saint Pontius Pilate in at least a couple of the Eastern communions, and this was a summation of various apocryphal narratives like the Acts of Pilate and several other ones where they're whitewashing Pilate so they can blame the whole thing on the Jews. That is kind of like saying like Saint Hitler. You are making dangerous associations there.
I mean, but granted, I mean, okay, yeah, it's dangerous associations, but when you look at Eastern Orthodoxy, they're no stranger to it. Like Saint Olga of Kiev, she was a viciously murderous woman. Like when people were coming in trying to say that they were going to take over her land and everything, she's like, okay, hang on. Just don't kill us. We'll throw a great big party for you. Throws a great big party. They're all drunk off their butts there. And then while they're in a drunken stupor, she sends in her smaller military and they annihilate them. They pretty much wipe them out. Or when ambassadors or suitors are sent to talk to her while they're on their way there, she had this great big bathhouse built and had them say, hey, no, you've ridden a long way. Why don't you take a bath first? And they're like, oh, of course. Let's go take a bath and enjoy ourselves. Locks them in and burns it to the ground with them inside. Like she was something else. And then they ultimately canonized her as a saint in Eastern Orthodoxy.
Well, don't forget that great paragon of Protestantism, Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess from Hungary. The reason she thought it was okay for her to kill hundreds of virgins and bathe in their blood to renew her own youth and beauty, as a spirit in her mirror told her to do. She figured, I belong to the Reformed Church of Hungary. I know that I'm one of the elect, and nothing I do will count as a sin. As a friend of mine once put it, saved by grace, oh blessed thought, sin as I will and never get caught. Well, now, would anybody say Elizabeth Bathory or this saint were typical Christians? That's ridiculous. But it just shows well, what's the fallacy there? I guess the hasty generalization fallacy. Yeah. And I see this on the internet all the time when they point out some psychotic who believed that Jesus was telling her to stick her baby in the oven and all that. Is this typical Christianity?
No, of course not. Of course not. I mean, are there some horrific and terrible things contained within the Bible? Yes, there's a lot of them. But, there are also some good little tidbits here and there that you find, I think, mostly in the New Testament. But some argue for some decent things in the Old Testament. Where they are, I don't know, aside from the fact that Psalms is, some pretty decent poetry. And I'll give it that. So in the same vein of historicity and things like that, I know you're a New Testament scholar, but I'm sure with your scholarly background, you may have at the very least a grasp, and probably a much better grasp than I do. But looking at the historicity of Moses, everything that I look into about this particular character is that he seems to be just that, a composite character. Like you find whole aspects of who he is as a character predated sometimes up to 1,000 or more years prior to his supposed existence in people like Sargon of Akkad being sent up the river in a basket of reeds. Or, okay, we have the 10 Commandments, the Ark of the Covenant and all that. Well, that seems to be based off of the Stele of Law from King Hammurabi. And then you have the water bending or the parting of the sea with that's found almost 2,000 years prior to that with Pharaoh Snefru. Although I kind of like Snefru's version better because it boils down to, he's floating on a lake or the River Nile or something like that with a bunch of topless maidens, and he has a court wizard with him, or magister, and one of the young things drops this trinket or jewel or something into the water, and Snefru's like, "Oh, no, I got this. Hey, you, get that thing." And the magister using his magic parts the waters, and then Snefru gets up, reaches down, grabs the little trinket, and hands it back to her. And now he's the big hero because homie's got pull, so to speak.
Well, that's also kind of like Elisha when the guy's on a construction job with Elisha's other disciples. He pulls back to smack a piece of wood with a hatchet, and the hatchet head is loose and flies off and plops into the river. And he goes up to, I love this, he goes up to Elisha and said, "My master, it was borrowed." So he's going to be in trouble for it. And Elisha causes it to rise magically to the surface, like just doing somebody a favor again. These things, they don't even have to be borrowed from one another, though they might, but it's just the same kind of stuff comes up again and again in all these religions.
So Elijah, I guess we could say, is the biblical Yoda, pulling the extra thing out of the swamp in Dagobah.
Yeah, boy, I tell you, that was a terrible error. I thought they should have had Yoda saying, "Ruined film, did I not?" And now they got Baby Yoda. Get out of here. Sickening.
Although, okay, I am sick of seeing Baby Yoda all over the place, all over the internet. It's drawing in a whole bunch of people who've never had anything to do with Star Wars that see a cute little Muppet and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I've got to have it." It's like, but granted, I'm all for new people becoming fans of Star Wars because I've been a fan of Star Wars for quite some time. And
yeah, me too. I saw it on the first day it came out, the first performance in May of '77. I saw it about 25 times in the theater, but it really began to slide, in my opinion, in the second one. The dialogue seemed silly, even though it was based on a story by the great Lee Brackett. Still, it was fanned to death somehow.
Yeah, it really seemed.
Sorry.
No. I agree with you. A lot of people's favorite out of the original trilogy was The Empire Strikes Back. My personal favorite was, kind of a toss-up between A New Hope and Return of the Jedi. And Return of the Jedi, the reason why I liked that one as much as I did, aside from the sheer implausibility of this galaxy-spanning military getting beaten by cracked-out gummy bears. Was the big culminating fight scene between Luke and Vader and all this, to the point where it's like, okay, I'll sit down and I'll watch almost all the films at this point, and it's gotten to the point where if someone has never seen Star Wars, doesn't know anything about them, I'll go ahead and expose them to the prequel trilogy and do it in a way that I think is kind of interesting because it makes the whole story about Anakin. And you start with with episode 1, even though that introduces midichlorians and it like completely ruins everything. But you start with A New Hope and you figure out that, Anakin is somehow dead. And then, we want to learn more about Luke Skywalker's backstory and who Anakin is. So we go back to episode 1 and then episode 2, which had terrible writing, but we won't get into that. And then go to episode 5 and you get the big reveal that Vader is Anakin. And then you watch the fall in episode 3 and then the redemption in episode 6. And so it just kind of makes it this one long saga about Anakin Skywalker, which to me, I think kind of repairs some of the flaws that are inherent to essentially all of the movies and all the storytelling within it. And I think does Lee Brackett's original work a little more justice.
Yeah, I've often thought it would be. I mean, I saw them all when they came out, so of course they're out of the canonical order.
Of course.
But I think it would be interesting to have your kids see them in the official order to see how much sense it made to them, and because they wouldn't have the same objections I do. But I
Probably.
have to admit the idea of the Antichrist becoming the Christ is pretty good. That even
Yeah.
late in the day, they had Anakin slaughtering children,
Mhm.
and sheesh, and they knew he was going to come back from
Oh,
the dark side, but that was pretty darn gutsy, I have to admit.
yeah.
Um,
And to I hate that I'm bringing politics into this, but when you brought up the whole Anakin slaughtering younglings at the Jedi Temple, the first thing that pops into my head, because I am a Second Amendment supporter, is nobody blamed the lightsaber.
right. Yeah.
I mean,
You only wish.
I know that's like pulling the pin on a grenade, and you're sitting there just looking at it like, ooh, shiny. But at the same time, it was a joke that oh man. But yes, the whole Antichrist becoming the Christ, I thought was really kind of interesting, and that's why I kind of have my little uh, weird watch order of going 4, 1, 2, 5, 3, 6, because you get to see that shift into being the Antichrist character, and then the sudden rapid redemption at the very end, that 11th hour change back to his original nature, which I thought was really kind of interesting. Although I think one of the best Star Wars movies that has come out recently, I'd have to say is Rogue One, and it's solely
Yeah, I thought that was much
because
better.
of the Vader scene. You finally get to see, the expanded universe Vader that all of us real big Star Wars nerds know and love, just how ferocious and just unimaginably crazy he seems. And you just see him let loose, just walking through and just cutting a bloody swath through everything in his way. And I think that was single-handedly one of the best looks at who Vader really was.
Yeah.
And I wish
Yeah.
we had got more screen time out of that, but it was so short, but it was so good.
I only hope Disney will decide to do more in between episodes, movies about Darth Vader as he really was.
Yes.
Boy, oh boy.
Like when he had Grand Moff Tarkin hunt him on that one planet where it eventually broke down to where where he disabled his own breathing apparatus and was holding his breath so that Tarkin couldn't hear him, so he could get the drop on him. Like, that was some amazing stuff that was that was in one of the comics, in the Marvel comics about. Yeah. That was something I thought was fantastic. Getting back on the topic of like Mandalorian a little bit and the whole Baby Yoda thing. Okay, yeah, no, Baby Yoda, take it or leave it. I don't really care about that one. But seeing it go back kind of to the original formula of mostly practical effects, focusing a lot on story and character interaction and things like that. I think Jon Favreau is doing a really good job as a showrunner for that. And I can only hope that if they choose to do more movies in the future, that they at least listen to him, because what he's doing is working. He's getting.
Is this the Mandalorian thing?
Yes, the Mandalorian on the Disney Plus app.
Yeah, I don't get that. I haven't seen any of those.
It goes back to a lot more practical effects. It's a lot more character interaction. It's very faithful to the cinematography and the style of the original trilogy. And it's drawn a lot of original diehard fans back into the fold, even just for this one thing. And that's probably one of the reasons why Disney's milking it for all it's worth. And even though all the episodes are already made, they're releasing them one every week at this point. But yeah, it's crazy. I'm gonna look and see if we've gotten any comments yet. I'm not seeing any. We've got a couple people watching, but no one seems to be commenting. If anybody's got a question for Dr. Price or me, please hop up and say something. But I think some of the people that normally would listen in on me are also listening to Reason and Theology right now. So, the curse of a small channel. But hey, I'm growing, or at least trying to. That pretty much sums it up what I had as far as things to do with the interview in and of itself. Was there anything that you specifically wanted to talk about, or something that you haven't heard discussed in a while that you find interesting that people just don't seem to bring up anymore, or just haven't brought up at all?
Let's see. Well, one thing I'd like to see more people explore is the Dutch radical critical hypothesis about the authorship of the Pauline epistles, namely that there aren't any, that all of the epistles are written attributed to Paul, who must have been an important early Christian figure, but that they were putting their own words in his mouth and to claim his authority, and that the earliest Paulinists we know of were Marcionites and Gnostics of various kinds, and people have assumed that the what you call them, I guess, the narratees in the epistles, the supposed church in Corinth, the one in Ephesus, Rome, etc., that these really don't reflect even the existence of such churches, though they might have been in existence by the time these things were written in the late or first or early to mid second century, but that so that we don't really know if there were such congregations, and that that they were probably collected originally by the Marcionites, who wrote some of them, and that later there are Catholic layers added to them to sort of domesticate Paul and water down the epistles. That bears on this thing you mentioned, one of the three supports traditionally of mythicism, that the epistles don't know of a historical earthly Jesus, and they're earlier than the Gospels. Well, they may not be earlier than the Gospels, but that isn't really the important point. It would show they still do not seem to have a miracle working teacher and all that stuff. This could, the relative date of the documents doesn't matter so much. The lack of any of that material could just as well mean that this comes from a different kind of Christianity, no matter when it was written down. But then again, I tend to think the Gospels are usually dated way too early, and that they still might be later than the so-called Pauline epistles. But even in the Gospels, because the narratives all appear to me to be based on Old Testament stories, and altogether they have Jesus sticking pretty close to the mythic hero archetype. It doesn't really matter whether you say that the epistolary Jesus was just a cosmic figure and thus a myth, but that the narrative Jesus of the Gospels wasn't. If he's so close to the mythic hero archetype, it's just another idiom of myths and legends. So it isn't really an alternative to it. So I think that those considerations are kind of important and are very seldom written about.
And that's the Dutch radical criticism of the Pauline epistles. I'm going to look into that. Like, that's not something that's, in all honesty, I've not heard of that before you brought that up. So that's something I really want to kind of dive into and look at. It almost kind of boils down to one of my favorite old black and white movies, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
I've never seen it, I'm sorry to say.
Towards the end of the movie, so Liberty Valance, as far as the movie goes, was played by John Wayne, was this famous outlaw, and supposedly Jimmy Stewart's character kills him, shoots him down. And so this whole movie is playing out from the perspective of Jimmy Stewart speaking to his biographer. And at the end of it, Stewart's character comes clean and says he didn't shoot Liberty Valance. He didn't shoot the John Wayne character. And at that point, the biographer has already printed a few things about this, and he takes his final notes and he just starts tearing them up and throwing them away. And Stewart's character is like, well, hang on. Are you not going to tell this part of the story? And his biographer turns and says, no, I'm not. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Huh.
And that's what this all kind of seems to boil down to, is that if and only if this individual actually existed, I firmly believe that if he did exist, that he was just a guy. He was just another man, because we still to this day have no evidence of anything supernatural ever occurring or being able to affect the natural world. So it doesn't make any sense to assume that even if this individual existed, that he was this supernatural figure. Mm-hmm. And it seems though, if the man himself existed, that this is a story that just got so out of hand, because you see the growing legend throughout, from Mark and then to Luke, Acts, and other parts of the Septuagint. It seems as though it got to the point with this growing legend that they just simply eschewed the actual facts of the matter because the legend had usurped the fact of the matter. Mm-hmm.
Did you ever see the movie version of The Last Temptation of Christ?
No, I can't say that I have.
You got to see it. The novel is even better, but they're both fantastic. And in the novel, Jesus one day catches Matthew by the campfire writing stuff down about Jesus, and he says, "Let me see that." And he hands it to him, and he says, where are you getting this stuff? I wasn't born in Bethlehem. I was born in Nazareth, and I didn't have a virgin birth. He tosses it back to Matthew, and Matthew says something about how this is the real truth, some way. But in the movie, in the book and the movie, later on, there's a scene after Jesus escapes the cross alive, though nobody sees him do it. It's sort of docetic kind of thing. Years later, Jesus is married with children because an angel, who turns out to be Satan, has told him, you've shown your loyalty to your father. He doesn't want you to die. Leave and live the life of a man now. You deserve it. So he goes along with him, and then he gets married, has kids, etc. Years afterward, they're walking on some road somewhere, and they hear Paul preaching, and he's saying Jesus was, as Harry Dean Stanton, it's great, he was crucified, and on the third day he rose again, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. And Jesus is standing there listening, and he takes him aside and says, you're telling lies. This didn't happen to me. I was never crucified and rose from the dead. And he says, oh, yes, you were. And he says, look, don't tell me what happened to me. So Paul gets the message and says, I'm glad I met you, because now I can forget you. People don't need you. They need my Jesus, the Jesus who was virgin born and crucified and rose from the dead. If I have to crucify you, I will. And if I have to resurrect you, I will, because that's what people need, not you. It is fantastic. And so thought-provoking and just great. And I won't tell you what happens at the end, but it's phenomenal, and it deals with these issues in so fascinating a way.
Well, man, gosh, I don't see how there's any way to top that, to kind of bring up a finale point or anything like that. That's a fantastic thing to bring up. I have to look that movie up.
You must see it. The book is great, and so is the movie.
I firmly intend to watch them, to at the very least watch the movie by the end of the week, and hopefully grab a copy of the book as soon as I possibly can. But that's going on the list. After Jesus Christ Superstition. I've been itching for that one for a while, so I have to get that one first.
I'll be interested to hear your reactions.
Well, I appreciate that. And hey, if you're willing, once I get it and get it read and start taking some little notes here and there, if you're willing, I'd love to have you back on the show, and we'll just
yeah, you bet.
Talking about that book. So I've included some links down at the bottom of the description of this video on YouTube, sending people to check you out at your Mind Vendor site, your YouTube channel, and also your Patreon as well. Was there anything else you'd like to plug or tell people about before we wrap things up tonight?
Well, just 3 books I have planned to write. It'll take a long time before they're out, but one of them is called Christ Mythicism and Gospel Christology, which is dedicated to analyzing the seeming paradox in mythicism. Mythicists say Jesus began as a heavenly being and then got historicized, made into a historical figure for theological reasons. Well, if that is the case, why do the Gospels seem to go in the opposite order, where Jesus is basically an inspired man in Mark, and then by the time you get to John, he's God in the flesh?
Right.
Isn't that the wrong direction? And I can explain why I think it's how we can solve it. Then the next one is Judaizing Jesus, where I take on the now universal ecumenical type of apologetics, where scholars, for the sake of better Jewish-Christian relations, a real good thing, are trying to redo Jesus as a first-century rabbi, to say that, well, you see, our figurehead was really, he really belongs with your religion. It's sort of like give away the store. And I suspect that is simply a theological construct of a new kind. Then the third...
That seems to be almost an admission of the old joke, or a joke that I used to hear, because I had a friend in high school that was also attending rabbinical school, because his father was a rabbi, if I remember right. Was that, oh, all you Christians are the same. You're just Jews that don't know how to Jew the right way. But anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted your flow. That third book, please. I'm dying to hear about it now.
That's called When Gospels Collide. And I want to take all these instances of big or small details between the Gospels, like who's Peter talking to when he denies Jesus? Did he heal the blind man on the way into Jericho or the way out? Did he cleanse the temple early or later? So on, and try to explain how these are not just stupid mistakes, but very often are editorial rewrites to make some point. So in a sense, I'm defending the Bible, saying that if you notice this kind of stuff, it will teach you more. It doesn't just debunk the Bible as a clumsy, bad piece of writing. So I want to take a crack at that and see what happens.
That's something I'm actually that I would be really interested in reading, because it's almost it seems almost a little bit similar to Loftus, John Loftus, when he was talking about when he wrote that book, saying how to defend your faith from an atheist perspective.
I haven't read that. I'm sure it's great.
I only know the title of it. I personally haven't read it yet. But I think I have that one on Audible as an audiobook. I need to listen to it. But anyways, Dr. Price, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. And I greatly look forward to having you back on again sometime in the future.
Oh, sure. Just let me know when.
All right. Fantastic. I'll be sure to shoot you an email. Well, everybody, thank you for tuning into the Atheist Reformation this evening. Again, my guest has been Dr. Robert Price. Please check the links out down below to support him. And if you want to support the stream, well, my links are underneath his, because I feel that his links are more important. So y'all have a great day and a good night. Thank you all.